Hello, I'm author and publisher Mark David Welsh and welcome to my latest reading roundup. And this week it's a cult cinema edition. And remember, if you like the video, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe using the buttons below. Now, the three books we're going to discuss today are all niche titles, but that kind of goes without saying when you're talking cult cinema. Your enjoyment of the books will obviously depend on how much you are invested in the individual subjects concerned. But hopefully most of you will be invested at least to some extent in cinema's most famous great ape, King Kong. Yes, we're kicking off today with Kong Unmade, the lost films of Skull Island, which was written by Lemay and published in 2019. In his introduction, Lemay explains that his original intention was to write a book covering the Kong-related films that have hit cinemas since the big ape took his first bow in 1933. But what he actually found was that the stories relating to the unproduced or abandoned projects featuring Kong were actually more interesting, so he switched the emphasis of his book. He still does discuss the development of those that did see the light of day, however, and he throws some interesting light on them. For example, I had no idea that Peter Jackson was in pre-production to deliver his Kong remake almost 10 years before it was eventually released, the project being shelved initially because of the box office flops of the US version of Godzilla and the Mighty Joe Young remake, both of which came out in 1998. And Lemay's summary of Jackson's original script for his film sounds a fair bit more interesting than what we eventually got. So, why were there so many Kong projects that got shot down in development over the years? Nope, it wasn't the biplanes or even beauty. It was something else that was responsible. The lawyers. There was a very long-running legal dispute over the ownership of the Kong character between original producer Miriam C. Cooper and RKO Studios, and this was only settled after Cooper's death in the 1980s. He won, by the way. And this conflict brought about a series of notorious lawsuits in the 1970s between Paramount Pictures and Universal over who could do a remake. Sadly, Paramount won that argument, and what we got was the Dino De Laurentiis 1976 King Kong, which was disappointing at best, but it also served to derail many other projects over the years. Further muddying the legal waters was the novelisation of the film by Delos W. Lovelace. Now, I had no idea that novelisations of movies back in the 1930s were a thing, but apparently they were. Lovelace's book was based on an early version of the final script, so it actually differs a little from the film. And because it was published first, for legal purposes, it's the original creative work, the film being viewed as derived from it, when it was obviously the other way around. Murky waters indeed, because Cooper failed to re-register the copyright on the novel in the 1960s, so some film producers attempted to mount their Kong projects by arguing that they were basing them on the book and not the original film. Obviously great news for the lawyers. Lemay details all this history chronologically, right from when special effects pioneer and Kong creator Willis O'Brien tried to launch his dinosaur epic creation in 1931, all the way to the empty Hollywood blockbuster of Kong Skull Island in 2017. And this is fascinating stuff. Some of the more interesting abandoned projects include Kong against Tarzan back in the 1930s, a concept originated by none other than Gone with the Wind studio mogul David O. Selznick. There was a short-lived proposal for Kong to meet Batman in the 1960s, as played by Adam West, several planned encounters with Frankenstein's monster, and legendary Italian horror director Mario Bava's abandoned Baby Kong film, and almost inevitably Bionic Kong and Kong in Space. At one point we were even going to get Abbott and Costello meet King Kong. Thank God that never happened, but it actually got further than most of the concepts I just mentioned. Now obviously there have been some truly appalling Kong knockoffs unleashed on the public over the years, mainly in the 1970s, the worst examples being David L. Hewitt's The Mighty Gorga, the 3D South Korean atrocity APE, and Hong Kong's Mighty Peking Man from 1977, which admittedly is quite the guilty pleasure. There was also a British gender swap comedy called Queen Kong, which was prevented from being screened in English-speaking countries by a lawsuit brought by Dino De Laurentiis, who didn't want it detracting from his own official remake. Apparently, Queen Kong stars Robin Asquith and Rula Lenska were both quite grateful that De Laurentiis actually won his case and the movie couldn't be shown. If you watch the film, you can see their point of view. Now, Lemay isn't as critical about these efforts as many commentators have been, including myself, but then he is quite obviously nuts for all things Kong. This is an exhaustively researched and it's absorbing read. It's hard to imagine a work better presented and more definitive than this. So if your heart beats to the sound of Kong, you owe it to yourself to get a copy right now. And if you're a cult cinema freak like myself, it's still highly recommended. Now, my second choice this week is To Be or Not To Be, a film actor's odyssey by Robert Clarke with Tom Weaver. Now, for those of you not familiar with Clarke, he was a jobbing film actor who arrived in Hollywood in the mid-1940s and played small supporting roles in some major films and graduated to leading roles on television and in B-movies, hence the title of the book. His cult credits include train wrecks like The Astounding She-Monster and the interesting Beyond the Time Barrier. But he's probably best remembered in the title role of The Hideous Sun Demon, a film which he also co-directed. The first thing to mention here is that Clarke doesn't hang about with his story. By page 10 he's already in Tinseltown, and by page 16 he's making his first movie under contract at RKO. And this is symptomatic of the whole book. Clarke seems like a genuinely nice guy with almost no ego, whose memoir is focused on the work that he did and the people he worked with rather than on himself. Now, he crossed paths with many big stars of the era, such as John Wayne, Alan Ladd and Clark Gable, as well as horror icons Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. And I was surprised to discover that he has small roles in historical horrors The Body Snatcher and Bedlam, which is one of my favourite Karloff pictures, because I'd never noticed him. Now, this isn't a book that dishes the dirt. Clarke's almost uniformly positive about everyone he worked with, but he isn't afraid to call out a few of them for instances of unprofessional behaviour. But of course, what we're here for is stories about the Sun Demon, the Astounding She-Monster, and his work with Jerry Warren, quite probably the worst film director of all time. Apologies to Ed Wood, but at least he was actually trying. Clarke recounts a particularly funny anecdote when Warren had him don scuba gear and lie in a puddle on the side of Mulholland Drive one night so he could get a pickup shot for the incredible petrified world. Rather strangely, Clarke fails to mention his experience on Warren's hilarious and insane Frankenstein's Island almost a quarter of a century later, and if you were to read the filmography at the back of the book, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Clarke actually retired from acting in the mid-1960s. But that was not the case. The book has a copyright date of 1996, and I initially assumed that perhaps Clarke had died before he could complete his interviews with author Tom Weaver, but Clarke actually passed in 2005. However, Clarke's wife of 40 years did pass in 1996, so it may simply have been that he didn't want to carry on with the project afterwards, and that's perfectly understandable. Now, obviously, if you happen to be a fan of Clarke, you'll want to pick this up. Otherwise, its appeal might be a bit more limited, but there's still quite a few nuggets here for fans of both cult cinema and more mainstream classic Hollywood as well. Finally, we come to The Dr. Phibes Companion by Justin Humphreys. Now, if you're interested in cult cinema and you're unfamiliar with Phibes, then you need to get yourself educated right away, because the badly disfigured genius plotting revenge from his Art Deco mansion in Belgravia Square is one of the essential anti-heroes of the horror genre. Played by the iconic Vincent Price in 2 films in the early 1970s, it's fair to say that each provides a wonderfully comic, yet enjoyably ghastly cinematic experience. The The first film came out in 1970, and the abominable Dr. Phibes finds our hero mourning the loss of his beloved wife Victoria and aiding the healing process by taking murderous revenge on the surgical team who are unable to save her after a car accident. The killings are based on the plagues of Egypt: locusts, frogs, hail, rats, etc. And this leads to some superbly gruesome set pieces. In the sequel, Dr. Phibes Rises Again, which came out 2 years later, he travels to Egypt, where he hopes to resurrect Victoria by punting down the river of life beneath a pyramid while singing Somewhere Over the Rainbow. The films have a deliciously dark humour and stunning 1920s production design, which features Phibes' own clockwork orchestra. Now, this book is obviously a labour of love by Phibes' obsessive Humphreys, who provides a fuller picture as possible of the film's genesis, production and reception, and also covers the appearance of the character in other media. He also provides intriguing details of the sadly abortive attempts to mount a third Phibes movie, which both Price and director Robert Feist wanted to do. Other writers also contribute to the volume, which does give it a bit of a scrapbook feel, but their insights are also valuable, so it's an essential device. I was particularly interested to read about the early versions of the screenplay by authors William Goldstein and James Whitten, which originally had Phibes living beneath the Golden Gate Bridge and his beautiful silent assistant Volnavia as a wind-up clockwork mechanism. Something which I always suspected from watching the films, but her true nature is never revealed in those, which I think was probably actually for the best. Curiously enough, watching the films on Blu-ray again before reading the book, I was forced to reevaluate my opinion of them slightly. Unusually, I'd always preferred the sequel, but I was much more impressed this time around with the original film. Mostly I think it's because a greater appreciation of its aesthetic qualities is now possible due to the pristine quality of the print on the Blu-ray release, which I can't recommend highly enough. One interesting tidbit: Victoria Phibes is played by an up-and-coming young actress, but a future cult cinema icon named Caroline Munro. Now, almost her entire role consists of lying dead in a glass coffin. Not the hardest acting gig ever, you would think, but she was dressed in a negligee adorned with feathers. And Munro is allergic to feathers, so she apparently spent most of the shoot trying desperately not to sneeze. Now again, this book is very much for the converted, but if you're a Phibes fan, it's truly indispensable. Well, that's it for this week's reading roundup, but I'll be back next week. What am I off to do now? Find a copy of that King Kong novelisation. It's still in print apparently, and also maybe the later Phibes novels written by William Goldstein. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you've enjoyed this video. Stay safe, stay well. Join me again next week, and don't be a stranger.